This past Wednesday, we had a presentation on assisted dying by the MAID team and a clinical ethicist. MAID stands for Medical Assistance in Dying. And it was a really informative and very gentle presentation on the options that Canadians have and Albertans have for end of life. There are some pamphlets on this if you or a loved one wants to know more that we have in the office. And you can certainly avail yourselves of those, or there's lots of stuff online. I think they said that there was a test you could take to see where you are and how comfortable you are with assisted dying, and lots of information. So if you have any questions, please do come to me. I'm happy to talk to anyone about this at any time. And the reason, I think, is because when I was in junior high, I was part of the debating club. That probably surprises a lot of you, hey? I took my lunchtime to debate. That's how much I loved it. And I remember one of our topics that we had was euthanasia, which literally means good death. And I think the issue arose because at that time, Karen Ann Quinlan was in the news. Some of you might remember her case. In 1975, she went to a party after she'd been on quite a severe diet, and she hadn't eaten almost anything in 2 days. And there at the party, she drank alcohol and took Quaaludes, and she stopped breathing. She was revived and put on life support machines, but after a while, they realized that she was in what they call a persistent vegetative state. And so her parents and the medical officials wanted to remove her from life support, but the prosecutor of that county in Florida, I think it was in Florida. No, she was in Ohio, I think. Anyway, he said that he would bring charges against the hospital if they allowed this, if they did that. Because the argument was that if they withdrew these measures, she would die, and so that would be murder. Eventually, her parents won in court, and Karen Ann Quinlan was removed from the respirator in 1976, more than a year later. And surprisingly, Karen Ann continued to breathe on her own. They hadn't expected that. Her parents never sought to have her feeding tube removed because her mother said, "We never asked to have her die. We just asked to have her put back in a natural state so she could die in God's time." And so she was tube fed for 9 more years until she died from respiratory failure in June 1985. The case for removing the feeding tube from someone in a vegetative state was much more controversial, and that was Terry Schiavo, if you remember that, who had been in a persistent vegetative state for 8 years. And her husband and legal guardian wanted her feeding tube removed this time, but her parents wanted it retained. And so it took 7 more years and the involvement of politicians, including George W. Bush as president, who signed legislation to move the case, this one was in Florida, from the Florida jurisdiction to the federal courts so that it could be heard. And finally, the feeding tube was removed and Terry Schiavo died. In Canada, we've had our issues too. The issue was front and center in the 90s with Sue Rodriguez, if you remember that. She wanted to end her life but was not capable of doing so because she had MS, or it was ALS, and she asked for physician-assisted dying. And the Supreme Court rejected that case in the 90s. But then in 2015, Carter versus the Crown came about, and the Supreme Court of Canada, in a unanimous decision, overturned that Rodriguez decision and brought in access to physician-assisted dying as a right in Canada. So anyway, back in junior high, I learned as much about euthanasia as I could, as you do when you're trying to debate. And the readings I had then talked about 2 different kinds of euthanasia. They talked about passive euthanasia and active euthanasia. Passive euthanasia is the withdrawal of life-saving treatment, knowing that the outcome will likely mean death. Death is the outcome but not the aim. It's the byproduct of withholding this treatment. Active euthanasia involves measures that will bring about a person's death, most commonly in Canada by injecting a fatal dose of medication to bring about death. Death in this scenario is the aim, not just the outcome. We were told on Wednesday night that there are two options for assisted dying in Alberta. One is a prescription, some pills that you can take yourself. And it usually takes about an hour to die in that scenario, and sometimes it fails. And the other is physician-assisted, which are injections, where the process takes about 12 minutes from beginning to end. So I would guess that most people take little issue with passive euthanasia, especially if it is voluntary. But there are deeper, more complex feelings around active euthanasia, physician-assisted dying. To be sure, there's always been active euthanasia, it just wasn't talked about. Many of us have seen the stories on TV about doctors who upped the amount of morphine and the patient soon died. And we've heard about this happening in real life as well. There's literature about how this happened over time and has always been a part of practice by some physicians. And mostly, people have just turned the other way, especially families who were relieved that their loved ones were no longer suffering. But one of the persistent arguments against assisted dying is that if we allow it, we are playing God. This phrase, playing God, is an interesting one because it's steeped in this belief that life is sacred and that only God should decide when you take your last breath. Only God should know the hour of your death. Only God can decide how you spend your last days. This is a very curious thing to me, this notion of playing God. And I suppose at one time, it was a phrase that made sense because medicine was primitive and often wasn't effective at all. Can you imagine if you've been in the Middle Ages and the cure was just to bleed you, for instance? That would have been fun, hey? There were no machines that kept you breathing or monitors that beeped if your heart stopped, and there weren't any feeding tubes or brain surgery or even antibiotics. Someone was sick, and you prayed they would recover, and if they didn't, God had chosen that hour as their appointed time. But now with the advancement of medicine, we live longer and we die slower. That's what Barry Clark, an academic who works in this area, remarked. Prolonged illness and a slow decline in health are common now. Thus the question, how do you want to die, becomes as important as how do you want to live. When medicine has advanced to such a state that your heart can keep beating and your brain and your breath can be forced even when your brain is no longer functioning, I wonder if the idea of playing God has taken on a whole new meaning. Because when we intervene to save a life, even if that means more suffering with treatments that push your body to the edge without actually killing you, why is that not playing God? To me, this argument, playing God, no longer makes sense. And so as medical advances have occurred, so too has our theology shifted with science. So in my Christian ethics textbook, which I reviewed for this sermon, the authors note that for much of church history, the overriding concern for any individual was that their life and death be such as to make it acceptable for you to be in heaven and far from the gates of hell. Fire and brimstone was heard, and you were afraid. So if you murdered someone or you took your own life, you were destined for hell. Suicide was against the law until the 60s in Canada. But since the 19th century, the notion of hell has been revised and mostly obliterated from a lot of our discussion. So this anxiety anxiety about the afterlife has diminished. So in our culture, the focus has shifted away from preparation for the afterlife to the quality of life lived now, the extent of human suffering that people are undergoing, and the autonomy of the person to make their own decisions. So this has brought on a persistent cultural and theological debate about who gets to decide when death is appropriate and life is no longer worth living. So we hear around us things like it's a personal decision, for instance, or that's no way to live. And as always, we seek to ease the suffering as part and parcel of a Christian commitment. But what that looks like may have changed. Because some Christians argue that compassion is allowing a person to die on their own terms. But others, like Gilbert Milanender, a Christian ethicist, argues that our duty as Christians is to maximize care, not minimize suffering. And so he says our response should be always to care and never to kill. And others argue that there is virtue in suffering, that Jesus suffered and so do we. And that there is some kind of awareness that comes upon you as you suffer along with those who are dying. And that, as always, God suffers with us too. The hospice movement arises out of these beliefs. It was started by an Anglican nurse named Cicely Saunders in 1967. And the principles of the hospice were pain and symptom relief and holistic care. So in hospice, the physical, social, psychological, and spiritual needs of patients and their family and their friends are of utmost importance. There is no treatment given for underlying medical conditions that have the purpose of sustaining life. So these are the things that swirl around this argument, playing God, which is murky. But then we can move on to that idea that's at the core of that, this idea that life is sacred. And who could argue with that? I don't think anyone who's looked at the face of a child that is just being born, or after they've been cleaned up anyway, maybe not right when they've been born, or have you seen the beauty of someone celebrating their 100th birthday? How could you deny that life is sacred? But here's the catch, I think. We have to put that word life in quotes. Because it's not the end of the story to say that life is sacred, because there are different perspectives on what that means. Abigail Evans, who is a theological ethicist, says that there are essentially 3 views on the sanctity of life. There's the first, which is the absolutist perspective, which believes life is good at any cost with no qualifiers. If there is life, you sustain it. After that is what they call the prima facie value perspective, which argues, yes, life is good, but it can be laid aside for other values. And then there is the relative value perspective, which argues life is good only if a certain level of existence is possible. Only if you can engage in life, you can sustain relationships. That is what life is. And where you sit on the continuum about what life is determines how you feel about physician-assisted dying. If you have no hope of returning to vital functions in your everyday life, and you are an absolutist, you definitely would not intervene. If you were a relative value person, you would feel that a compromised existence is no way to live. These are the people who say, we put our dogs down. Why do we make humans suffer? So this question of what is life is central to how we view death. Perhaps life is not just physical life, not just biology. This seems to be the understanding of our scripture reading. Because Moses is speaking to the people who have been wandering the wilderness for 40 years, a generation in biblical terms. This means that most of the people that he is speaking to don't remember what it was like to be a slave in Egypt. They were not present when God made the covenant. And so now is this renewal of vows. Moses is once again talking about renewing this covenant with God so that these young people who never knew will understand and be a part. So God's speaking to the people through Moses and explains what is of utmost importance, it says. The covenant between God and the people is not a commandment that is found in heaven with God. It's not way up there, something we can't understand. And it's not in a far-off place that can't be reached across the sea. Rather, the word of God, the laws of God, the covenant of God is in your mouth and your heart, so that you can follow. The commandments are written in your soul. And so Moses said, God has set before us life and good, and death and evil. Life is found in obeying the commandments of God, by walking in God's way. A life that is tuned to God, a life committed to loving God, promotes good and blessings. But a heart that is turned from God, that's drawn to things that diminish life and cause harm to others, results in evil and death. And so Moses says to the people, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life that your descendants may live. Moses isn't talking about biology. He's not saying preserve life at every cost. Heart beating is not the definition of life. And that phrase, choose life, has been hijacked by people who have political motivations. Life is intimately attached to how you orient your days. It's imbued with the commitments you make, the relationships you forge, the love you share, the good you bring, the comfort you bestow. That is where life is found. And in this age of modern medicine, where we live long and die slow, it's probably time to move away from considering life as measured by a pulse and a breath, to life that's measured by one's ability to engage in the stuff of human existence, the joy and the pain and even the suffering. So if life is not just about biology, who decides when life can end? After all, one person might believe that every last breath is worth taking and fighting for, and another's pain may overwhelm them, and another would never want to live without bodily functions. That to them is no life. And so the Canadian legislation is very clear that it is the individual patient's perspective that matters. They are the only ones who can decide when it is time. And just to make sure of the resolve of the patient, that this isn't a momentary lapse in judgment, in our legislation, 2 doctors must meet with the patient and ensure that they're making the decision fully aware of the consequences. A patient can say no right up to the moment of the injection. But there is still much controversy, especially amongst medical professionals. And so the legislation also provides that practitioners are able to abstain from participating in assisted dying on moral grounds. but for those who participate in medical assistance in dying as practitioners like the ones that we met on Wednesday. Their belief is that this is an act of compassion for the patient and the families. And as such, they try to meet the last wishes of patients, whether it's the kind of music, a song that they want to be played, or a favorite last meal that they want to eat, or the place in which they want to die, who they want to be there. When the MAID team was here, they told us about two very different instances. One was a man who wanted assisted dying, and he said, "Do not tell my family. I don't like them, and I don't want them here." And then the other was of a man who was a farmer, and they took him out to his field, and he looked over his land in his last moments. So it's understandable why some feel morally opposed to this service. In my own family, I have a medical family. I've had discussions which have become very heated. Some are afraid of the slippery slope that someday it's not going to be left to the patient anymore, that medical professionals are going to decide this person should be over. That hasn't been borne out in other jurisdictions who have been practicing it longer, but it's still a concern. And another one that my sister expressed is that families are going to have undue influence. They're going to want to get, the inheritance sooner, and so they start pressuring their parents. It's very heated, these discussions. It's not possible in our legislation at the moment for someone to have undue influence. That's why the two doctors who are unrelated have to see the patient. But we can see in our minds how someday it could be abused, or in some instances. So there's good reasons, including theological ones about life and about sacred life, to be hesitant about condoning assisted dying. But honestly, it's one of those issues that has no right answer. There's no good answer to death and dying. It's tragic. But here's the thing. If you or someone you love comes to the point where they're tired of this slow dying that our culture has introduced, where they've suffered enough, where they want some control over the end of their life, whether you agree or not, this is no time for, but maybe there's a cure around the corner, just hang on. Or, don't you love us? Do you really want to go? Or, you can't play God, it's not your choice. Whether you agree with the decision or not, you are called to compassion, to love unconditionally, to comfort, to reassure, to hold a hand, sing a song, to just be there with God and each other as they prepare for what is beyond. Because this is what I know. God is with us from our first breath to our last. And whether we choose our ending or let nature take its course, God is there with grace that is deep and wide, welcoming us home. Amen. I invite you